can't overcommit the minimum memory though
Correct.
on the host.
And the thing is, it's all about capacity planning and just kind of playing the averages. You're gambling a little bit by saying, you know what, I need, I have 100 users to support on the server. Each user needs 2 gigs of RAM. That's 200 gigs of memory, but they're going to average maybe 1 gig. So
128 might work.
Yeah, exactly. And you kind of figure out that best cost balance. And it's all based on it'll kind of based on timing as well. These guys need it in the morning. These guys need it in the afternoon. Then you block it. Smart paging. Smart paging is a technique that's used to ensure that in a scenario when you have dynamic memory, when you have the startup RAM bigger than the minimum, that you can still boot, right? So let's say that you've got your memory is so committed that you want to boot a VM that needs 3 gigs to boot, but there's only 1 gig left. Its minimum is 512. You can still boot that VM because it will actually do an additional level of what's effectively a page file to allow the boot. It'll be slower, but it will boot, and then hopefully after boot settle down into running an actual memory. So it's a technique to allow virtual machines to boot when the amount of memory they need for startup is not available. That's what smart paging is. It uses basically a page file on disk.
And so basically what you're saying is we're temporarily creating more memory, but rather than doing that in the memory itself, we're actually doing it on disk and kind of simulating
Yeah, you do it, but it's basically a page file.
And then as soon as that memory gets freed up, we will actually, take it out of the page file, put it back into fast, real memory so that you can continue using it as a, normal virtual machine.
Absolutely. Next piece here is the integration services. The integration services, we kind of alluded to a little bit already, are something that
Welcome back to the server
really
virtualization jumpstart. I'm
honest.
Simon Perryman, Microsoft
back when Hyper-V first came out, because it wasn't released with Windows, it was released a little bit later than Windows.
And I'm sorry.
People would make VMs.
Sorry for what?
Well, we ran a bit over on the last one.
They
The
didn't
problem
add
is
integration
components. Integration components are basically
A lot of good content, and I mean, we had so much on storage, we didn't want to hold you guys back.
Yeah, well,
I know you're pretty passionate about
storage
security
is
and
my
tools.
favorite
And
tool.
SMB as well, right? I know we're going to hear a lot about
Just
SMB.
the drivers
Yeah,
you add in to make the operating
stop me,
system
'cause we might be here till
virtualization.
5
The cool
talking
thing
about
with
this thing
Windows
alone,
is
but anyway, we got a lot to do,
they're
so let's
there
jump
by
right in.
default, starting with
So first of
2008
all,
R2 and Windows.
I mentioned earlier,
they're just
get
in there
this thing
already.
done here.
I think it might have been this to SP1 even.
There we go.
Started.
So
It's been a while.
Yeah,
But one
eventually
of
there's a
the,
thing
one
on
of the
basic
more
level.
interesting
And it's
investments
called a
Microsoft's
cluster
been
in a
making
box.
recently
Cluster
is
in a box.
investments around Linux
Now,
and open
in and
source.
of itself, it's
So you've
not
actually
an
built up the
entirely new
entire
concept,
open
but
source
if you
Linux
start
team.
looking about
they contribute to the
looking
Linux
at,
kernel, so the actual open source project.
deploying,
and now we
especially,
actually include
Windows
our
file server
integration
storage, right?
components directly in the Linux
So
kernel.
if you're going to
So
deploy
if you get a
Hyper-V
Linux
on SMB, which
distribution,
is Hyper-V Enterprise,
CentOS and Ubuntu,
you better make darn
SUSE,
sure
Red Hat,
that
any of
the
those
file
that
share
are
is highly
built
available.
based on those
Right?
Linux distributions.
Just like,
those
if you
integration
talk to any guy that's building
components
clusters,
come out of the
okay,
box.
you're
So
just
you just
already there.
what do you
boot the operating
Tell me about
system
your
in
SAN. They're going
noses
to say,
running
well, it's going
inside
to be
a
dual
VM,
controller and
and
going
then
to
you can
have
do things such
multiple
as live
paths through
migrate
multiple
those
switches.
VMs, do
And
backup
they're
using
very,
data
very
protection manager
passionate
with,
about
consistency.
the
And
particular
even take advantage
configuration
of
that the
dynamic
SAN has
memory
to
for
have
those
to make sure that
Linux
it's
virtual
not
machines.
going to go down. Yeah, so
Right.
dynamic memory for
Redundancy
Linux is
everywhere.
exactly.
significant thing
And
that's
so
new as well.
when you start
brand new,
looking
yep.
at building a Windows file server
there as well.
if you're going to run,
and then you'll
Hyper-V,
see within the VM
on that
some
Windows file
services that
server,
run, and
you've
then
now
on
got to
the VM
have,
itself,
you
you
can
can
what's
actually
traditionally done, which is
control
some
like
of
fiber
these,
channel
SAN. You've now got to make sure that
some
you
of
have
these
that
integration
exact same
components
level
under the
of
settings under integration
redundancy and
services.
availability. And to be quite
the
frank,
file
there's
server level,
not a
so
whole
you've
lot
got
of
this kind of
reason you would
twin
ever
layer of uber
disable
complexity,
it.
where I've got multiple
production
HBAs going to
Not a
multiple
whole lot.
switches, going to multiple ports,
But
but
the only one you might want to
zone,
disable.
all that work's got to be done. Then on the front side of the
reason
file
for that is
server,
what this does
I've
is
got to
when
make
the
sure I've
VM
got
boots,
Ethernet
save it or
ports
apply
that go to
snapshot,
different Ethernet
syncs
switches
the
that go to
time
different
with the
Hyper-V servers.
and it
keeps
just
the time of the VM
complex.
synchronized.
And so
with
what
the underlying
Microsoft
host
wanted to do was
operating
introduce this idea of a
if you're
storage
using an
appliance running
external
Windows
source and you want to make
kind
sure
of
all
remove
your
some of that
assorted
complexity.
operating systems and
Love
VMs
these.
are
I've already
using the
bought
time
3 of them.
source
I've spent over
as opposed to
$150,000
the host they're running
I
on
plan on
as
buying
the source
3
of
more
time.
real soon.
You
So
turn
this
this
is-
off
this
and
is- I
point
love
that's
this
the time source.
Um,
That's the
but
only
if you think
real
about it, have a look at
you know,
what
fairly
is
common, I
typically
guess.
makes
I
up
don't
the
even know how
back
common
side
it
and the
is.
front side of a
But
SAN,
for
right? Of a
legitimate
traditional
SAN
kind of
production
production relates this back
scenario
to you guys
for
that do SAN
coming out
for
with
those
those
integration.
integrations.
So on the back side, you
Now,
got
the
multiple
other time that
physical
we
interfaces,
use that
pools,
host
lungs,
integration components on is actually when we do
storage
some
management
development
technology.
testing.
On the
And we want
front
to kind
side,
of always
behind
roll
that you've
back
got
to a
a
specific
SAS
step
bus,
of time,
what's
so that we
on the
can
inside
kind of
of
see
most SANs,
active
and then
items
disks
in the
plugged in, right? So 6
logs,
gig or
in
a
event viewer,
multiple 6 gig
in
SAS bus,
Perform.
and the disks
So
are
by
all plugged in
disabling
there.
that host time
And
synchronization,
that's that's what everything is.
take that and having a snapshot,
and you have all
can
these
roll back
abilities
to
to
the
do
snapshot.
pools, to do LUNs, to do
The
provisioning,
host
to do
does not sync
snapshot
to the
zoning,
current time, so
and
you
depending
can't
on
kind
the
of
amount of money you
simulate
spend
still
and the
living in the
rate of
past,
the
being
sand
frozen
you buy,
in
you get all
previous
sorts of
points
fun
in
stuff.
time. So that's
On
kind
the
of the
front
only time
side,
I've
you've
used
got
that.
Yeah, absolutely.
interfaces.
So in terms of
Might be
we
fiber
mentioned
channel,
storage
might be
devices
ISO,
attaching storage to
um,
VMs,
or might be
you have
SMB,
now
for
a
example,
virtual
fiber channel
fiber channel
breathing.
adapter.
But
And
this is
also
basically what a
pretty
SAN enclosure is. It's two
addition,
controllers on the
because what it
backside,
enables you to
a
do is
SAS bus on the
directly
inside, and a
attach
bunch of disks
fiber
plugged
channel
into it, and then a
storage
piece of software
to
that presents all the disks as logically
so you
units of
actually have a
storage.
virtual HBA
That's what
that you can
you
connect.
know,
Now, to kind
deploy
of show
more
you
than
where
one of
this
these.
goes,
That's
I
what,
can't do it because I don't have a HBA. But Windows storage
but if we go add
appliances,
hardware,
right? We can add
it's
a
a
fiber
set
channel
of,
adapter. And then it will
it's a
actually,
set
you
of
actually define
cluster
virtual
nodes, so two
SANs,
cluster nodes in a
and you
single
can connect the
enclosure
fiber
with
channel
a shared
adapter to a
SAS
virtual
bus
SAN,
and
and
it
it
has the
has
same
and
worldwide
JBOD,
names,
JBOD,
which are
just a bunch of
fiber
disks.
channel for Mac
Cool
addresses,
acronym, I think, an IT person.
that you would see when you do
So
real
JBOD
on
is
a
the
disk,
God physical
two Windows
HBA
Server
configuration.
file server nodes that
So I
have
go up
multiple
under
Ethernet ports at the
Virtual
front
SAN
end.
Manager.
You have the exact same
actually
logical
create a fiber
architecture
channel
of an
SAN.
enterprise-grade SAN without any of the complexity of having to plumb the
default
storage
name
in addition to the cluster
under the
nodes,
VM.
typically on less power, in less use, and typically very, very simple and easy to configure.
So who actually is building all of these pieces and putting them together? Is this the OEM
Fiber
that's
channel
providing
SAN.
these?
It's an OEM-based solution, and
And
there are
away we go.
companies
But
that do this.
the
The one
problem right
that
now is there's
the
no
one
post-bus
we're
adapter
using
in
today
the
is
machine,
something
so I
called
can't
Data On. Legitimately,
which
which
I bought 3
configuration, but that's really all you do.
And we'll
you
show you
then
some
take
pictures of
these
it here in just a
worldwide
second,
names
but
that you
it's
can edit,
essentially a two-node
modify,
cluster powered by
and
storage space.
Your
So the
fiber
storage space
channel
is in,
SAN,
so
which does tiering, deduplication,
if you have an actual host
all
bus adapter
those
card in there,
enterprise
your
grade
VM will
SAN
now appear as a
level
host
functions,
function.
and your SAN can now
and
be
just
made
presents
available
it as a
to your VM.
two-node file server.
In order for this to
So
work
when you're going to store
completely across the
Hyper-V,
board,
there are
if you want to
certain
bring up
fiber channel
another
adapters
Hyper-V
you have to
server,
use. They have
all
to
you got to do is
support
add it to a file server.
function, which I
Now
forget
you
the
mentioned
name of.
spaces.
unfortunately.
What exactly is storage spaces?
That relates
actually,
to
we'll get
virtual
to that
fiber
just
channel. But if
briefly
you
in a
go in
second.
and you look up, I want to kind of just show you what the architecture of
I want a fiber
a
channel
cluster
adapter
box kind of
that
looks like. So
supports
this is
HBA.
there's just a series of functions
this
that
block
block diagram
has
kind of
support.
shows you what
If it
the
does,
logical
it can
architecture
pass
is.
those calls
So you have
through
two
the
server
VM,
nodes,
and the
typically
VM
inside
can
the
be
same
on the fiber
enclosure.
channel
Each
SAN,
one
and
what's
what's
neat is you can storage controller has multiple paths through local storage. You can actually migrate through an expander to another, which can go to external
onto a
JBOD,
completely different
HBA. But the VM will
we've
not
done
lose
two
its connection to the
configurations
SAN
of these
because the
projects,
worldwide
and one
names
is,
go with it. 12 SSDs
And we're actually seeing a lot of
plus
people using
24
guest
or
clustering,
48
taking
external
advantage
disks
of
in
this
2
fiber channel.
JBODs.
Because fiber
Actually, now
channel,
back to
whether
back,
it's on
so
a
we can use
physical
up less
server
space.
or connected to a VM, can still
and
be
then
shared.
one
You
that has
distributed
72
access.
disks
So
inside
whether
the
you want to
single
go and
enclosure,
use
it's a 4U
iSCSI for your guest clustering,
and with
a shared
having a mix of
VHDX style,
SSD and
or
spinning
use
disks,
fiber
we get to
channel,
take
these are
advantage
now
of
all
storage
supported for your
tiering,
guest virtual
which is a
machines.
great new
The
technology
reality
as
of it
well.
is that
So this is what
most
physically
IT
looks like.
organizations
that have made
this
an
is actually
investment
one of the
in fiber
ones
channel.
known to
They hear me say,
finding,
fiber channel is kind of hard, and they kind of
Dana guys are
I know.
listening.
They're probably going, hey,
another
yes,
word.
they know how to do it. They've invested in
It's
it.
coming.
It's not hard
but you can
for
see
them.
out
So
the back,
this
where,
is,
you know,
if you were to look at
Highly
a
recommended,
traditional
yep.
SAN,
No reason not to
you'd
use
probably
this.
be thinking,
well,
well,
that's
hey, you
where
can
the-
plumb fiber
you know,
channel
that's where the
to a VM.
controllers
They go,
slide
okay,
out.
cool, no problem. That's
Do
what
it at
they
your
are.
own time.
The nodes function.
So
as
it becomes
controllers.
another option for
All
guest
controllers
clustering.
are in big enterprise
And I know,
SANs
for
are
scenarios like
little mini
SQL and
operating
whatnot, where they
systems that
want
control disk
really,
size.
really
And that's
fast
what these things are.
best
With the
as
benefit
possible
of,
disk
rather
throughput,
than you
this
having
is
to
the way to
run
go.
fiber
Fiber
right to the VM,
deal with
you can still get the
multi-cam,
benefits
deal
of
with
being a virtual
DSMs,
machine, deal with
huge
LUNs and zoning. All you do is present a
Great.
file.
Well, let's move on to our next
so
section and
easy.
talk a little more about
And then when you want to create a new
installing
VM
and
that's
importing
on
virtual
the new wave SAN, the
so
cluster in a box,
when we
the
talk
new
about
wave SAN,
installation, what we're really talking about is
how do I get an operating system in the VM?
And I'll show you this here in a little bit
because I've got this running on my demo environment. CD, DVD, ISO
So,
file. As a comparison from
Pixie
traditional
boot it,
storage like a
doesn't
fiber channel or
matter.
iSCSI,
You can also do
storage
but
tiering.
I think
You
it's
get
pretty
that
cool,
data
which is the,
duplication.
what
You
used to
get
be
that
Win the VHD,
RAID
it's now
resilience,
called
resiliency groups, pooling, disk
So there's
pooling,
a
high
PowerShell
availability,
command
write back
that you can
cache,
download off
copy
of
offload,
Complex
and snapshots.
that you
Now,
basically pointed
a lot
at
of the
an
the guys
ISO or
that
WIM
are
file. So you take like your
real
Windows
SAN
installation
ISO
gurus,
file, extract it.
There's this,
Which
my
Windows
big huge
supports
SAN I paid
natively.
$150,000
Get
for.
the install.wim file.
This isn't as good
Point
as
this
that,
tool at
and
it, makes it
they're
easy.
right.
Very
And
nice.
it can be really
VHD,
high-end
VHDX,
enterprise
it can be
SANs
10 gigs,
offer
20 gigs,
functions and
1,000
features
gigs.
well, truly above and beyond
and
what
you just
make
make
a
a
VM
VM
out of that
appliances
VHD,
with,
plus 300 box
and that's
offers,
done the
and that's
effect of
fine. There's a
installing your
place for
operating
those,
system
right?
for
But as a a
So
low
installing
cost,
VMs, the operating system
highly
piece of cake.
performant, highly
VMM
flexible
makes it
solution
even
for,
easier because you just go, hey,
for
this
failover
VM, that
clustering
host,
for
that
file
operating
servers,
system, go.
you really can, and it's got everything.
Now,
it needs
another
ready to go, and
advantage
you'll
as
be
well
showing
is
some
since
of
you're
that
actually
tomorrow.
managing
Yep.
this using Windows Server
Importing.
itself, the underlying hardware
Ooh,
can
something near
vary.
to
You
my
know, you're
heart.
not really going to have to be locked into the same OEM,
the-
the same hardware provider. You could get a cluster in a box from
With-
one organization, another
well,
from another. and
Best
have
way
a
to tackle
variety
this
of
actually
actual
is
different
there's been a lot of
back-end,
changes on this
storage
front.
providers, yet you
The
still
first thing
manage it
is,
with a single
with
consistent
with
interface,
2012 and
still using
2012
Windows
R2,
Server file
you no
services.
longer
So it gives you some more
have to
flexibility with
export
your
VMs.
pricing and costing.
With 2008,
models.
the big objection
in order to get a
that,
VM from one host
I
to
hear when I
another,
talk to
export
people
it.
about this,
I mean,
they
a
go, well,
copy
it's
of
a
all the
two-node cluster. I want to add a third
a lot
node.
of I/O,
and
okay,
copy all
you
those
can't
files
add a
over,
third
and
node
you
if it's a
import them.
two-node cluster.
And the import, if there was
but
anything
that's
out
just
of
a trade-off.
whack,
You
if
have
there was
to decide.
files that had
You can
moved
use, for
around, or
example,
there's an
a
ISO
traditional
file
SAN, you
missing,
wanna
you
add
had
a
a
third
third
and fourth node,
and
you
it was
can't.
not the best
With
of
these,
experiences.
there was an API.
You know, there's not just
where you
two
could do
node clusters.
you could
You
fix
fix
all that, but it was an
four
API.
nodes.
16 larger. Yep.
So, and Microsoft recognized
It's a matter
that
of
this is
kind of
this is a
planning
pain
in
in advance.
advance.
So
So
you're right, like when you buy a
what
SAN,
they've now
you can't
done
choose to add a third
is
controller to it.
you can just take
This
the
kind of
files
operates
from a
this
VM.
methodology.
One
And
of
you
the
can just
things
copy
that's new
them
for
and
Windows
do
Server
what is
2012
needed.
R2.
We're not going to spend a lot of time on
registration.
this because this is
And
not
so
a
for those of you that are
virtualization technology
intimately
per se.
familiar with this, you may have
And I know
noticed
there was a
in the past, there was
jumpstart
these
recording a
.exe
couple weeks
files
ago that focused
and
on
config.xml,
storage. So
they're
they're no longer there.
Check that on the
Now
Microsoft
just
version.
an
Yeah,
import
to be able to kind
folder
of get
structure
more detail on
and
this.
an
And I
exported
also know
folder
that
structure
when Rick and I did this,
and
in
if you just
our
copy the
jumpstart
files,
a
you can
number of months
register.
ago, we showed some demos
So
of storage
it's a
tiering.
huge step
But
forward.
essentially,
to
you
make
can
this
have
simple. And
some
the UI
solid-state
now
drives,
figures
some,
out all the
expensive
things
fast
that
SSDs,
and some less expensive, not
might
as
be
fast
broken,
hard drives.
you know, or might be messed
And,
up.
you know, the ratio that a lot of people
change and whatnot,
kind of settle on
and
these,
switch names change and prompts you to fix those as you do the
90%.
import.
So 10% SSD, 90%
Virtualizing a
spinning
physical
disk.
machine, and what the storage
And
tiering will do
this is there's a bit of a sore point here
automatically
because
move hot data
there's the notion
to
of
SSD
P2V
and leave
conversion,
cool
physical
data
to virtual
on hard
conversion.
drive. So you get
System Center
the performance
supported
of
that
SSD
previously
for the
because
data
release
that you hit
actually
most
doesn't
often.
support that.
And it's done at a block level,
Hyper-V
not a file
doesn't
level. So
include
literally,
native
you do have a VM. Part of the
so
VM
there's a couple of ways that you can actually do a physical to virtual conversion.
So you get a VM
And one of them is using a tool called the blocks contained, which is a transaction logs tool. Looks like this.
We'll go
And you
post
get the
that link.
benefit of
SSD
looks like this right here.
SQL
You pointed
transactions
at a drive on a
without
machine.
needing all
you take
the
a snapshot of the
SSDs
drive,
higher operating
makes a
system,
VHD,
including
and
the
you
stuff
can then
wouldn't
boot that into
necessarily
the
need.
VM. Now
You can pin
having
files,
done this a couple of
which
times,
means
but
you
the
can
only
force
real
certain files in their entirety
annoyance
to
in
a
this
certain
process is
tier.
you've got to deal with all the driver changes.
You know, conceptually,
you boot it,
I
it
kind of
detects a
think
bunch
of
of drivers,
tiering as
you reboot
almost
it a
like
couple of times, but
memory,
generally
on an
works
actual
pretty well.
server. So the things you need to access faster,
In
those
terms
get
of
cached in
application,
local
we've kind
memory,
of covered this a
quick
little bit
access,
already, so we're not going to spend a
the
great
stuff
deal
you
of
don't
time.
need gets stored on the
The way
actual
that you
hard drive.
interact
So
with
you
the
can kind of
VM
think of it as,
interactively on the
a similar
host is through
concept.
virtual
For those of you that are
Connect.
really geeky,
VM Connect is this application right here that I'm
tiering,
running right now.
the evaluation as to
It's
what
native
should
on
be on
part of the
SSDs
RSET
hard
tools,
drive,
part of once a
Hyper-V.
day at 1 a.m. Double-click a VM, this is
Schedule
what
tasks.
comes up, runs on port
the
task
2179.
scheduler.
So
So
you
you
can,
can change that. Right, you can go in and say, oh, I want to do it
The
4 times a day
enhanced
or twice
session
an hour.
mode,
It's up to you.
I believe we've kind of covered this already,
depending
so I'm
on
not going
how
to cover it again in the
often you
interest of
think
time.
the hotness
But
of
as I
data
mentioned
will
before,
change. Right?
available for
So you can
2012
adjust that.
R2,
You can also
gives
force
you
it
RDP
with either
level
access
PowerShell,
in the
or you can
console
also force
session,
it with the old
regardless
defrag
of
command.
the
There are
network.
two ways that it actually does it. And both those tools can report
All right, so let's talk
how
about
effective
checkpoints.
that's actually being. So.
Now, we
Alright,
mentioned
so
storage spaces a few times. Let's go into
checkpoints
some more
are
depth
the
here.
equivalent
Okay,
of
sure. Actually,
snapshots.
let's go
Now have a look at
Simplest way to
demo
do this
real
is to
quick.
do some examples of it.
Okay,
right?
let's do it.
There we go.
So what I've got
So first
here,
of all,
if you
a
wanna kinda
snapshot
take
is
a quick look,
basically
this
a
is
point
a
in time on the
scale-out
VM
file
that you
server.
can roll back.
We're not going to get too
So
much
for
into
example,
the file
this VM
server
is running right now. I can take a
component of this,
snapshot.
but let me grab
Right-click it, check over cluster manager. And so what this will actually do, you can see it right here,
and
create
just
the
connect to this. So
checkpoint.
what I've got here is a
So I now
cluster in
have
a
a
box.
point
This is one of the
data
on
on
19
units
that was actually in the
PM,
photograph
where
in the slide
I
a few
can,
slides ago. I have a
and I've set up a
file
freeze
server
frame
that's
with
got
that
a
VM.
file server
I
role,
can continue to work. I can make a bunch
which
of
is running a
changes,
scale-out
and I
file
can
server, which is
roll
a
back
new
to that
type of
state.
file
So for
server.
example, if I open up
This
this
isn't your
VM,
traditional Windows file server. This is a
right
scale-out
here, and I
file.
go,
It's a
well,
new
let's,
kind of
take
file
this
server.
folder and it's got a couple. It's got some shares that are running. And there's a share here called
It can do
VMs,
bitmap image.
where I'm
So I've
actually
made a
converting
modification
VMs
of the
from.
VM. And
I
to
go, you know
kinda
what?
give you a very
Didn't quite work out.
deliberate
I can now
example
go
of what I'm
back
doing
and
here. This
apply
WinClient VM
this checkpoint.
that's
By
over
applying
here
that
on
checkpoint,
this
I'm saying
first node.
this is the version of the VM that I
Actually
want to be
running
made active.
off that scale-out
It's going to
file
prompt
server.
me and say, hey, you're
You
going to
can
apply
see
this
here in
checkpoint.
the,
If you do,
in the path,
the
way
way
it is
for now
this
is going to get
VM
removed.
is
So do
running
you want to
on
take another
the
checkpoint?
scale-out file server.
Or do you just want
Not
to apply?
the
I'm
actual,
going to choose
not the actual
checkpoint
VM itself. The
applied,
VM
just to show
itself
what
is
it
still
does.
on the local storage of the cluster, but the VHD is actually over on the scale-out
Bunch
file
of stuff
server.
happening up here as it does the work.
And so this scale-out file server,
And so
for
now
its
I've got
storage,
see kind of structured
uses
around
a storage pool.
using
My
storage
VM
spaces.
roll back to the point where
you can see that it's got some
I
virtual
didn't
disks.
have, and it's got some physical
connect to
disks. And you can see the status of each
I
physical
didn't
disk,
have that bitmap on
slot
the
number,
desktop.
enclosure number, bus type, and all sorts of information on it. So this is the type of thing that if you're a SAN administrator,
Drop
you're
that
used to
screen resolution
seeing
all the
in
way
the
down to
UI
super
for your
small.
SAN. So if you go into, you know, if you use like a Dell SAN or an HP SAN or EMC or XIL or any of those,
back to that
when you
point
go in
time
there,
where
this is
there
the
was no
type of
bitmap
stuff
on the
you see.
desktop.
But I've also now
tools,
got an additional
allocations.
point in time. And then
I
within
can actually rename this.
Server Manager is where you actually get to administer all these storage pools. So we got a storage pool
And so I
area
can now move that
shows
VM
physical
essentially
disks.
back
And this
in time
exposes
and forward
things
in
like
time as I work with
on the
additional
physical disks.
configurations.
toggle drive light. This is
Right,
great
so
for
if you have
dev,
one that,
for
for
example,
example,
if you're working through, you know, you're building a server, you're maybe not sure you're doing it the right way, you can take snapshots at points in time of the build.
I've already got this done, so I can't do it again.
But it's just a matter of running through a simple wizard,
trying to
picking the physical
uninstall
the application, which you know
maybe
doesn't always
when you go to
as
create
well as you
a
would like,
virtual
you can
disk.
just revert to
And
the
again,
previous snapshot.
we're not
Trying to get
and
too much
it's as
into
if it
this,
never
but
even
you can do what's called
Right,
thin
I've
or,
been using
or,
this
or standard
actually
provisioning. Thin
through
provisioning
demo
allows you
type
to define
environments
more
to
space
kind of
and
show
actually have
different
an
states of the
later,
system.
which is
So
a
you know,
traditional
Corey and I have
SAN
been
function.
working together to build a
If I
lot
go
of
into
Windows
virtual
Server
disk,
system set demos.
choose the
And we
storage
constantly
pool,
want to say, hey,
give it
we
a
just need
name,
to show
just call it
demo
test.
3 out of
And
these
because
10.
it's identified
and so
that there's a
by using these
combination of SSDs
checkpoints
and
and
hard drives
taking
in
them
here, I can do
serially
create storage
as we're
tiers.
building up this infrastructure, it
It'll
allows
say,
us
all
to
right,
move not just
what
back
type,
in time,
simple
but
or
also
mirror?
forward
Yep.
in time. And
We'll do
really
a
jump
mirror
between
so
these
it's
different
replicated
states
and
to
protected.
really show a dynamic
Do a
infrastructure.
two-way mirror.
Where
And then it
checkpoints
goes,
can
all
get
right,
confusing for the uninitiated
how much
is
hard drive space
deleting
do you want
versus
and how much
applying.
SSD
Because
space do you want?
they're not
And
as
I've got very
it's
little
not as
available because I've
straightforward as
used
you
most
might
of what's
think
on
it
here.
is.
So I've
For
got
example,
like a couple of
if
gigs
I
left.
apply a snapshot, I'm deleting
So we'll go
changes.
specify maximum
If
size.
I
for each
delete a
of these.
snapshot, I'm saving my work. And so it's a bit of a confusing concept. Let me try to explain this a little bit
the
here.
wizard.
I've got this bitmap on desktop right now. That represents
Now,
a
you
state.
did mention that
If I were
this
to
tiering
delete
is
that
only available
snapshot,
on 2012
what that's
R2,
going to
but
do
Spaces
is
available on
merge the
2012
changes of that
2012
snapshot
and 20
So you could get
up
some
one
questions,
level.
you know, actually
So
asking you
I'm
about
basically saying I want
what
to
has
keep
come
up. By
out
deleting a
from the latest
snapshot, you're saying you
version.
want to
So
keep
as
all
far
the
as the
work.
storage capabilities go,
By
Spaces
applying a
is
snapshot,
2012
you're saying
RTM.
you want to discard
Tiering
everything
and
but
what
this
we're going to be
current
talking
state.
about, sorry,
And you can
tiering
create,
is 2012
you know, very
R2.
complex.
And
I
the other
create
thing we're going to be
snapshots
talking
up
about
here.
shortly is
So I can
data
apply this one.
deduplication. Different trees,
That was also different
available
trees, and you can
on
have
version
multiple levels in
2012
very complex
RTM as
snapshot
well.
environments.
So really, tiering is the
Take the
only
time
new
to
one
learn
that's
how to
unique to
do this
2012
before you start doing it in mass, because inevitably you'll
moving
delete
on
something you meant to keep,
disk
or keep something you
duplication.
meant to delete.
This is a
So you've got to get your head around the terminology for it. Now, let me try to show you an example
of what happens.
It essentially allows you
So
to
here's an example of this
take
little
a bunch of
screenshot of
disks
what I
on
was
a
talking
drive,
about before.
run, it's not compression, right? The net result is
showing what that
you put
might
gigs on a
look
drive
like for the run distance of maybe building out a server, for example.
Compression does that, but what compression
Now,
does
what
is remove white
snapshots are
space
actually
from
doing
files.
at the file
What this
level
does, it looks
is
says,
creating
okay, you have
this
differencing
4
disks
times
on the disk.
So when you create a
we want to
snapshot,
store it
we
once
talked
in
about diffs and
record
bases a little while ago.
So it
It's
eliminates
actually duplicates at the
creating
block
differencing
level,
which
and
means
that
it's
differencing disk
incredibly
contains
efficient
all the
on
changes from this
VHD
point in time
library.
forward.
You
And when you delete the
operating system, you
snapshot,
get 200
the
VHDs
differencing
in a
disk is
folder.
merged back.
That's
and you
200
apply
copies
it.
of the Windows operating
It's
system.
the
Think of
differencing disk is
duplication.
deleted, and the new one
I
is
did a
started over.
test with,
So you got to think of it as
one of our
how
archive
things
drives.
were
So
at
we
a
take all these
particular
lab
point in
VMs,
time, and we archive them off.
So here's an
once they're
example
all
what
up and
happens
running.
with file
Put them on
level.
an archive drive. Put them on a
I
shelf.
want you to
in case
focus
the
on
SAN dies.
not the stuff on the
and we're burning through
right-hand side, but the stuff on the
50,
left,
60,
which is
80
a very much
terabytes
simpler example.
of drives on these, 2,
So
3,
we
4
take a
terabyte
snapshot. The
USB drives.
snapshot was taken with that little red
duplication.
dotted line. Now we've got
Or
the changes
deduplication.
that are being captured
And went
in
and
what's
got
called the
upwards of
AVHD file, or the
98%
auto
of the space
VHD, which is the
Well, and
snapshot.
that's because so many of them are just
They're just
Windows
identical.
Server.
Take another
Just, yeah,
snapshot,
Windows Server,
and you
Windows
now
With
get
Server,
something
Windows
on
Server,
top,
yeah.
tiny bit on
So you create
top.
this
And
tree.
it's so identical that,
So if you were to
98%,
apply snapshot
compression,
at this point right here,
not the right technical term,
what you're
but
saying
that's
is
sort of the net result
how
of
the
it.
machine was at this point in
with
time. which is
R2,
everything from
it now
here
supports running
backwards. So phenomenal in BDI
Everything
scenario.
from here,
because if you can run deduplication and you can take
everything
all your
from here
VHDs and get them
backwards,
down to a smaller
what
disk,
you want to
disk
keep,
footprint,
all this
that's
stuff up here goes
more
away.
of the actual data that can
So
be
that's
in
why
RAM
apply is
cache,
delete.
which means it'll run
Delete
faster.
everything from this point
Which
forward.
means
So
more
performance benefits as well as
more
storage
can live on the
What that does
storage
is
tier.
basically
And
deletes the
SSD
AVHD and recreates a new one.
So the
if you were
result
to
is
delete
the
a
coverage you
snapshot, let's say I
have
delete
is
this one
much
back
better.
here, you're saying
So the
I no
performance is
longer
much better.
want the
Now,
ability
one
to
other
go to this
catch
point
you
in
could
time.
see on the exam is R2
You're not
also
saying
added support
delete
for
the
cluster
files,
shared
you're saying
volumes, or
delete
basically
the ability to
virtual
go to this
machines
point
that
in
live on
time.
shared
And when you
clustered
do
disks.
that,
So if you
this
have
point
a
in time
question
right
around
here,
troubleshooting
all these
deduplication
changes
doesn't
become
appear to actually
permanent
be saving
and
you any
merge.
space, make sure you check what
like this.
version you're running. Because deduplication
And you'll actually see a merge
operation
displayed in
types of
And that
And
can be
I don't
done
know the
while
answer
the
to this,
VMs are running.
which is new and cool.
Parity is or is not supported on cluster shared volumes for deduplication.
So
exporting,
first
first of all, you don't need to do it anymore, but you can export to VMs. There's something about there's a support element. It's a really nice little package of files, very, very structured, very neat. I know there's a difference there somewhere, but you can export a VM while it's running. and you can
And
export
then finally, offload a
you
data
export a
transfer. This is,
snapshot.
so
It's going to take all the related differencing disks,
cluster in a box.
merge them
This
to
is
get
traditional
one
fiber
the output of the high-end SAN. And when you import the VM, if you want to move a file from one server to another, and they're both live on the same SAN, even though they're on different LUNs, traditionally what you have to do is actually move the file
talking about snapshots,
through
when should you
one
use them?
server.
Well, first of all, you only use them dev test.
Over the
Use them
network
in
into the
isolation.
other server,
And if
back
you
onto
have
the
an
same
infrastructure,
SAN,
it might actually land, for example, you said you're building some demo environments that presumably contain more than one server.
Network
you
traffic
always
as well, right?
apply and
So
delete the group. What ODX allows you to
never
do
do
is say, hey,
individual
SAN,
servers
move this
because
file
they
to here
get
out of
associated.
sync.
And it'll actually,
for example,
let's
let's
say
say
that
that
I
I
join
join
a
a
domain,
and the move
right,
is
there's a domain
domain
password that happens.
It's sending off and
and
redirecting
I revert the
clients, it's not
VM,
even
yeah,
copying
or
and
revert the
pasting.
domain
So,
controller, but
you
not
know,
the client.
it looks like the
still
file
thinks it's
copying
domain
happened,
The
but
VM doesn't know what the
Now,
client
could
is,
you
so
use this
there's
to
a
say
disconnect and
VM
it's broken.
deployment? You want to
That
go
can
deploy
get
a lot of
really,
VMs.
I don't know,
Absolutely.
really ugly
All right.
production
Do much
environments.
faster
So look
VM
at this
deployment
example
because you're
here.
basically starting with a
This is
VM
why
on
you
a
never
storage array. Say I need to
checkpoint
clone
domain
this 50 times.
Yep.
Could be much faster because you're not actually
there's a fix
copying
for
that,
it.
one
So
10
here's a
gigabyte
domain
file
controller,
to a
right?
different
And
location.
what we're looking at here is
Essentially,
what
keep it
happens
within
when we
the same
create
storage
users. Can you think of any service? So I create a checkpoint at a particular point in time. Pay attention to, in this example here, the RID pool in the USN. So pay attention to SMB3. I mentioned this earlier.
And what are the RID pool in the
huge
USN?
improvement, right? And so if you look
the
at this
numbers
list
used to
of,
generate the SID
features that are added in SMB for
So I create 100
R2.
users. The RID
This
pool
is
has now
all
been
the stuff
advanced.
that you
So I've
traditionally
used some
find
of
in
them.
I've made 100 updates to Active Directory, so the update sequence number I'm running right here is one of the differences with a scale. I then replicate that to my second domain. So I've got a VM that's running on cluster node 1, and cluster node 1 goes down.
I didn't mean to make those
Now,
users. I'll
in the
just
past,
revert the
VM's gonna
checkpoint.
blue screen.
Storage went
Really
away.
simple way of
With
doing
this,
it doesn't. It just fails over to node 2 to 100. The RID
because
pool
it
maintains a primary
However,
channel on the first node, and then through a program
this guy
called
still thinks
SMB
it's
Witness,
200.
it
He
has
still
an
thinks there's a bunch
alternate
of
node that
users
it can
out there.
flick over to immediately.
So I create another
So if the
150
node goes
users.
down, it
Get it
just
right
falls
this
over,
time.
which is what multi-channel is.
Advances,
But again, which is what you get when you have multi-channel with transparent failover. The result of
you have
that is
scale out, which means you can
we have
add
50
additional
users
nodes.
replicated.
There's a
and
bunch
it will
of duplicates.
automatically
The
start
RID
to
pool's
use
all
that.
messed up.
So you have
in
conflicting
the
SIDs
past with traditional
and
file server
your spend
clusters,
Saturday
the
night
file
and
server
Sunday.
lived on one node and the other node was idle.
So all the traffic was
Active
here.
passive.
People
Exactly,
did
this
this
in
is
production.
active.
And
So
Microsoft
all
Export
nodes
had
will automatically
dozens and
balance
dozens,
their
if not hundreds of billions of millions of calls.
SMB
about,
Direct we talk about. There's additional SMB
replications
encryption.
broken
There's now
a
volume
domain
a
controller.
volume
Well,
shadow
yeah.
copy provider.
Well, that's
for
why.
SMB shares to make sure that if you're doing backups
So
over shares, they can be
Microsoft
consistent.
introduced something called
by taking
VM
the
generation
role
that
had
had
transaction
transaction
logs.
logs.
This is a
things of
way
that
for a
nature,
domain
and then it's
controller
all
to be
supported via
supported for
This
scenarios
has to
where you're
work on
using
both sides.
checkpoint. It is not backward portable to 2000. And here's basically what it does.
It's 2012 and
So
later.
first of all, it's a 64-bit integer, basically a GUID.
And then finally,
that
because
is
of all
tied
that,
to
you
the
can
VM
now run
configuration.
VMs over.
And it's used to
That's- at the end of the
identify
day, that's-
when an
that's the goal
action
for
has
us.
taken place
that
on a
Hyper-V,
host
you know,
that has the potential
almost better
to
than
move the VM
direct attached
forward
storage
or
or SAN
backward in
RSC.
time.
That's
It's
the
almost
key.
better on SM.
And so these would include
because you
things
have
like
the save
much
states,
simpler,
easy to
snapshots,
configure.
import
All the stuff you need is
So
fully
something that
supported.
has
You
the
know, put right
ability
infrastructure in
to
place,
take a
and you're
domain
basically
controller
A lot
and
of diverse
change its
OEMs as
time
well. Yeah,
forward
using
or
that
backward.
single consistent
And it's that
management
change
framework.
of time forward or backward.
All right, well, we have
that
we've
causes
gone and we've wrapped
potential
up kind of a
replication
host deployment
And so
steps.
if it
Really talking about
detects
how we set
that
up our
there was
infrastructure,
possibly a change
do
in
some
time
planning
forward
and
or
best
backward,
practices. Now we're
it
going to move on and
immediately
actually look at deploying our
assumes that it's
virtual machines
wrong
and managing
and
those
tries to
VMs.
essentially
on our
sync up with all the other
So what are
domain
we covering in
controllers
this
that it
module,
assumes are
Corey?
correct. So essentially,
And
this
so by
is
doing
doing
that,
that.
how do you administer
itself
Hyper-V
from that
from
scenario
a,
that I just
from the
described?
standpoint of just
Without VM,
there's a
how does
component
basic
called the
admin task?
Hyper-V generation counter.
Hard disks, virtual
There's a
machines,
GUID
types of hard disks
stored
installing and
on
importing
the
virtual machine
domain controller
checkpoints and
Active
some
Directory
objects.
object.
We're going to try to,
which represents this,
and it's
try to,
also
you know,
stored
take this to
in
a,
the
I guess,
XML
a
configuration
little bit
file
of a
of the
technical,
VM definition.
deeper technical level than what the bullets would
If you were to look in the
imply,
event log when you
and
apply
kind
a
of
snapshot
sort
or a
of sort of
checkpoint,
teach you
you'll
the
see an
best
entry like
practices,
this.
things that are maybe
A
not so
generation
obvious.
ID changes
You know, for most
what
people,
that means
creating
is
a VM is
you
it's
perform
a
an action
through
on
a wizard,
Hyper-V,
pretty straightforward,
but
that
has the
some
potential
things you got to be
change
aware
the
of and
time
think about to make sure that when you do it, you
Hyper-V
don't
then
put
changes
yourself,
the GUID in a
bad
config
situation
or kind of paint
the
yourself
domain
into a
controllers,
better
the service in the domain
So the
controller,
first
this guy
lesson
right
that we
here
deal with is
detects that the
DHT.
config file's got a
So
passes
first
the
of all,
GUID
what
via
is
memory,
essentially
into
what
the,
is
into the
the domain controller.
Right?
It
VHD
detects
is basically a file format.
The one that I had,
you don't need
and the one that's on the
VMs
host are different.
to
Therefore,
use
something
VHDs.
happened on
They're
the host
supported
to change
natively in
the Windows operating system.
I'm immediately going to
you can
assume
use
I'm
Disk
wrong.
Manager.
I'm going to
to
inbound
create a
replicate
VHD
from everybody
whose
else.
PowerShell
I'm not going to accept any new
It doesn't
objects
have to
until in
contain
an
an
operating
operating
system.
And once that's
I've
all
had
done,
people
I'll
use
be happy.
VHDs like a zip
So it
file.
prevents that. It's a
bad
container
scenario
file
from
format that VMs happen
So
to use.
that's that.
So
and,
what are
you know, it
some of
comes
the
in
ways that
different
we
formats
can,
and
you know,
styles
just
and
make sure
whatnot.
that our hosts and our VMs are monitored?
When you attach VMs,
this is going to be
again,
pretty
it's
simple
the
stuff.
hard
So
disk
we're
that a
kinda
VM's going to use.
lighter,
There's two ways you can do it. IDE or SCSI. You know, performance monitoring is, with IDE, it's the limited,
straightforward, and people
generally know how to do it.
disks IDE
And the fact that it's,
been around
monitoring VMs
eons
doesn't fundamentally
or you can do
change
SCSI.
anything.
We have multiple SCSI
But you
controllers.
have to
lots of
realize that
disks
you're no
for
longer
SCSI
monitoring
controlling
for VMs that have, you know, many
100% isolated
what would appear to be
environment.
directly
There's
other
hard
things
drives.
that you maybe can't see that
They
are
mentioned
impacted.
Gen 1, Gen 2 VMs in here. We'll get to that.
So
in
first
just
of
a
all,
second.
you know,
there's
know
a
what
new
performance
thing
monitoring
for
is.
R2.
Yay, cool.
Tools
So
you
in
have
terms
available.
of
Task
formats,
Manager.
there's two formats you'll bump into.
Might seem trivial. This is probably my favorite tool.
VHDX is the newer format.
Whenever someone says, hey,
bigger,
there's a
badder,
performance
faster,
issue on
better.
either a server or in a
That's
VM,
all you need to know.
This is the first
64
place you go.
terabytes in size.
And what you're looking
much
at
more
is that
consistent in
performance
terms of
failure
tab,
and the
it's the
applications
default
to go. You
format.
know
You can convert
what's
from
using
one to the
memory,
other
what's using
as long
this.
as your VHDX
And usually,
isn't so big
after I
it can't
stop
become
here,
a VHD. Step two is this guy. And then if you're going to
So if I go
upload
to
to
Azure,
Azure,
you
you
wanna
want to use
use
the
the
VHD
VHD
format. You can,
and
and
so
so
there's a
grab
convert command
Task
with Manager.
PowerShell, or within the,
And if you're,
you know, if you're dealing with a little more
UI
advanced
for
for
Hyper-V,
Hyper-V,
nodes,
you have how the sockets are being
And
utilized.
for our VMware
change
administrators
graphological
out there, that'd be
processors, those are being
equivalent to a
utilized.
VMDK
One of the real neat
file.
things, by the
Again,
way,
just
is
the hard drive that's used by our virtual machine.
if you're dealing with,
you can
and I've
actually
seen
come
this
here
here under
some of the original
disk,
generation
pointed at any, you know, VHD or VHDX
They
file
were single
and do
socket.
things like convert it.
So they would do
shrink it, make it
offloading
smaller,
of
change the
10 gig
format,
Inspect
but they'd
it,
hammer
inspect
it
it,
to make sure it's
inspect it.
valid.
Yep.
So we go in there and
So
go,
it's all there, and it's all
why is
real
the
simple,
CPU
real
performance
straightforward what it
like
is. And you'd see one
There are
node, which
two
is one
basic
socket,
types
pegged
of
at
hard
100%,
disks.
the other at
There's
0.
fixed and dynamically
So
expanding.
you're not getting all the
Think of these as, you know, reserved space versus use it as you
and
need
so
it.
you get to see these things.
In the past,
Just
there was
here
a
in
performance difference.
see
Today,
exactly
there's not,
where
but
there
there
are
are
some
some
things you want to
used.
think about. And you
With
should
a
see,
fixed size,
equal
if you
performance
create a
across
2
all
terabyte
the
six
sockets
size
with
VHD,
the new nodes.
you're going to wait a little while
because it's going to go in and write
then
2
on the
terabytes
resource
data to your
monitor.
disk. And so depending on how fast your
Which is
storage
typically
is,
your next step,
creating
you go,
that
okay,
disk
quick
might take
overview.
seconds, minutes, hours.
You know, what's using memory?
But you might not even
And I'm
be using
typically
that full
looking
2
at what's
terabytes.
the,
Correct.
but you have two
what's
terabyte
the working
disk
set of memory for any given process?
with a dynamically expanding. It's instantly
Typically look at
created.
the network utilization
and the
to see
file
what
will grow
services are
physically
doing the most
as you
network
add
input
things
output
to it.
So I just look
The
at total,
downside
and then
is
the same
it
thing
can
with disk.
become
What is
fragmented,
actually using
and
the
you can
most
overcommit
disk
storage
within a VM.
So you've got to
or
plan
on
it
the host.
accordingly. If you're looking at,
you
I'm
know,
going to put
looking at
I've
the
got 2
host, will
terabyte
tell you what's
storage,
going on
I'm
inside
going to put a
the
bunch
VM.
of stuff on here,
So that's
and
when you
you
start
start
looking at
adding things to those VMs. It's confill
what they're
unsaturated
doing.
storage. So it's something you've got to
But
plan.
this tool
and
here,
monitor.
you know,
in my mind is
I tend to
very
rely
often
on dynamic
overlooked
because there's a
expanding
wealth
99.9%
resources available.
because
So
I
you can see
monitor
how
storage,
memory
I
can
know
be
when I
broken
need
up,
to make it bigger,
how
I know
disk
when I
is
need to
being
be
broken up, and I love this view right
and
here
then
for
periodically we'll
Look at the queuing.
defragment stuff during
What's the
maintenance
current,
windows
what's
just to get
the,
it all nice
you know,
and
what's
clean.
the lag?
The benefit is I get, I get to
this is
provision
low,
more than I
we're good.
effectively
If
have.
it's
in
high,
these
we're
items.
bad.
Now, exam question you might see is if you troubleshooted a Hyper-V host and the virtual machine stopped,
And then finally
what
your
is a
event
good
viewer,
check?
which
check
everyone
it
is
to make sure that
pretty
they have
intimately
additional
familiar with
disk
by now. But
space. It's
Hyper-V
not gonna be
has
those best
within,
practices.
and I
So
think
if
few
you are
people
using this dynamically
are
expanding
aware
disk,
of this.
you are over provision and you run out of space to write.
So
this
we
will
just
cause
look
your
in event
virtual
viewer. There's
machines
actually
to
an
shut down.
entire
So a good
subset
troubleshooted
of
step to check for
events
that. But an
dedicated
even
to
better best
Hyper-V
practice
under
is
server
implement
roles.
monitoring.
So
you
this
can
is
detect
focused
this ahead of
explicitly
time.
on
We'll cover
Hyper-V,
that
so
one too.
system-level events
So
that are
different
generated by the Hyper-V
again,
role.
they're
Then
pretty
also under
standard
Windows across all
logs.
virtualization platforms.
For application service
Essentially, what
logs,
it allows you to do is
Microsoft
create a
Windows.
parent disk,
Start digging
and
down
then
in here.
a differencing disk is effectively a clone
Hyper-V,
that doesn't contain any data. And if you look at the little
Sorry,
graphic
Hyper-V
here, as
VMS.
you
So this is the
read
management
data,
service. This is where you see things
it's
like
read from the parent. As you write,
our VMs booting,
the writes are
VMs have,
intercepted
you know,
and dropped into
adapters.
differencing
What's
disks.
the, have I
So
created
over
and
time,
modified
the
things?
differencing disk will grow. As
and then you can
modify
also,
it,
with
and
these guys,
eventually, it'll become equal to or greater than the
Under
parent.
view, there's an analytic
Differencing
and
disks
debug
are
log
not
option,
generally
which gives you more
recommended for
advanced,
any kind of production
nauseating
scenario.
A lot more data.
Except, it's performance impacting data.
Right.
But
Because
with
you're in an
VDI,
advanced
you often will
troubleshooting scenario.
redeploy the VMs.
It's valuable.
trade-off.
And differencing
It's
disks
valuable.
are a good way to do this.
Now,
In
a
fact,
good
the
best
wizards
practice related
that
to the
come with,
exam here is just kind of get a brief
I know with
understanding of
VMware,
what
I know
each
with
of those
Citrix, I
different
know with
Hyper-V
Microsoft,
event logs are used
all
for.
leverage
For example,
differencing
you
disks
might
as
have a
part of their
question that
VDI
says,
deployment
hey,
as a way to
noticing a lot of
quick
disk
deploy
I/O.
VMs.
Where should information, you go to
So I'd start with a base
and then you
image
can
that
kinda look at
contains an
those
operating
tools we
system,
mentioned here,
rather
Task
than
Manager,
deploying the
Resource
operating system
Manager,
over and over and over and over
and then
again.
the event logs
You,
to try to
you make
drill
different
down.
things.
So
The
the
task manager gives you, the only thing you got to make sure is that,
on
if
the
you're doing
client,
this,
it has a nice
as soon
little
as you
disk
make a different
tracking
disk,
tool.
I don't know why that's not in the base in any way, shape, or form. The diff is corrupt. I can show you right here.
Best practice.
On the server, I've seen people, that are not familiar with this, create a VM, create a base disk, task manager, create a bunch of different things to solve that base, and then I want to put
Look at that. Well, my assumption with zero knowledge behind it would be that on a server you're using SAN storage more so you still got local disk, right?
I would care about that in a server. The base is off for everyone, and it's very useful because it tells you the difference in disk average divided by base. But if a diff exists, activity and then the read write speed, which tells you how much you're pushing through your modify it, you corrupt the diff. Very that simple.
So maybe you called out a good point there. If you're looking for local disk stuff,
you can use direct attached storage.
Go and use one of those other sources.
So instead of the HDD files, the reliability you can directly attach hard drives to VMs. Shows you this is done. It's pretty straightforward. If you go into a VM, you look at the settings on it. That's and you come down here under the storage area. Well, this can show you potentially add a hard drive that was changed. You can see that I can actually go through a physical disk. And then finally, this is new for the physical disk directly into the VM. This is new for server 2012. So why would you want to do this? Resource metering. Resource metering is a way of measuring the I/O of the VM for memory disk and network. Maybe your vendor for the purpose. It was basically for the purpose of require it. So if you were looking at what does it cost me to run a VM so I can charge some performance element or some file format they want to use as part of native drive. It gives you a tool. It's also a good way to get. This is very hard drive that you want to. It has the framework to get into a VM. You capture the data. Hard drive. But the reality is, there's reasons you might want to do this. Almost of no use within PowerShell. From a performance angle, when it's bubbled up, there are scenarios where SAN performance, that's where the data performance might be better than VHD. And you want to directly attach the SAN disk to the VM. This is what allows you to do it. It's actually quite trivial. Directly attach VMs running here if you need to. If you do direct attach, we can do a git VM. You don't get to do things like this VM has a couple of nodes like live migrations and exploits. So you're bound to that physical VMs running on it. So you'll lose a lot of the benefit of virtualizing when you go to a directly mapped hard drive. So those are the two VMs. I can just enable. There's a new capability that's been added for R2, and this is one that you want to spend a little bit of time on. When you're looking at preparing for an exam, and it's a per VM setting, which is for virtual hard disk sharing and QoS. And then so these are two they've run for a while. I come in here and go measure R2. Let me kind of explain briefly what they are. So if I take a VM here and look at the settings, I take a hard drive. And kind of expand my way down through into this advanced so you can see that it's got I have an area called enable QoS, average RAM, new RAM, min RAM. What this total disk network inbound megabits per second, total network outbound megabits per second. That Hyper-V will allow a particular VM to write to a so it's the basis for this. Something that I know folks have wanted. So as over time you collect this data, the ability of the data stored with a single VM that's consuming all available moves with the VM.
That could negatively impact everything else.
Absolutely, feed and things like that. And so folks are well and truly used to, the guys, talk to the guys that do your firewall, right? They've got QoS no, that's pretty much what you can stream from media.
That was a big one. So in summary, we kind of covered the basics of creating your VMs, managing them, testing them for performance,
or whatever.
And with our next module that we're going to return to in about 1 hour's time,
you can do the same thing now with storage. You can do this with networking. So this is, on the network adapters, this has been in there for a while.
And
you can actually go and configure
can go and connect to other hosts, to each other, and to our outside world.
But it's now been added as well to the VHDs themselves. So you can come in here and say, for example, 100 IOPS is all it allows you. It does an 8K increment. Now, the 8K is relatively important because if your underlying disk system uses 4K IOs or 16K IOs, you've got to factor that into what this is. So, for example, if you're looking at your underlying storage and saying, I wanted to limit it to, 200 IOPS on my SAN, but my SAN does 4K IOPS, you would put 100 in here, right? Because this is twice as big. Likewise, if your SAN did 16K IOPS, you might put 50 in here. You might put put 400 in here because you got to do the math on it, basically. So pay attention to that. Know that this is an 8K IOP, and know that if you've got a SAN that does a different level of IOP, you may have to configure this a little bit differently.
Now, minimum bandwidth for networking and minimum IOPS for storage. This guarantees that that particular VM always gets at least that much, right?
Correct. And if not, it's going to generate warnings. Right? So if it cannot satisfy the minimums, you're going to see warnings appear in the event logs. It doesn't guarantee it per se because it might not be possible, but it will
least
tell you.
alert
It
you
will
if there's
tell
a
you that,
problem.
hey, you know, you don't have enough to meet your minimums. And then the max is how you would limit something entirely. So that huge SharePoint VM that's consuming all your disk I/O, you come in and say, you know what, no more than 200 IOPS, you're good to go. And so it has that effect of, you know, leveling out the hills and valleys of everything. And then the other one is, as I said, shared VHDX. So this is a huge item for hosters, right? So if we go back to this scenario of guest clustering.
And again, that's the VMs that have an application running within them, right?
Correct. So guest clustering. I have, let's say, a scenario of SQL Server. Okay? So I have 2 Hyper-V hosts, and on one Hyper-V host I have SQL Server Node 1. On the second Hyper-V host I have SQL Server Node 2. If I want to cluster those, right? Because remember, if with live migration and quick migration and failover within VMs, if the host goes down, the VMs power off, transfer over, and power on again. That's downtime, right? That's you know, maybe minutes or seconds or whatever.
For an unplanned failure.
That's for an unplanned failover. By doing active guest clustering, if that node goes down, the application can just fail to the other, you know, can automatically fail to the other application that's running on the other node. To accomplish that, you've got to get shared storage to your VMs. Now, there was only one way to do this in Server 2012 and Server 2008, which was iSCSI. And people just went,
Now, why is that? Because iSCSI performance isn't optimal if you're trying to run SQL?
iSCSI performance is never as good as something like Fibre Channel because it's got the overhead of TCP. There's all kinds of, you know, people that claim it's good and better, and certainly there are good implementations of it, but you know, iSCSI is just, it's not something that I'm personally a fan of. You know, for big production systems, I prefer things like Fibre Channel. So you can kind of do 2 things. One, you can attach Fibre Channel directly to a VM now, which we'll get to later on, but you can actually define a VHD as being shared between 2 VMs. And by having the 2 VMs share the same VHD, you get shared storage inside the VMs. Now, there's some requirements for this, and one of them is the shared VHD has to live on a scale-out file server. So you're back to this Hyper-V over SMB scenario, where both SQL instances live on a scale-out file server. They're clustered under Hyper-V at this level. Up here, they're on a scale-out file server. There's a shared VHD on the same scale-out file server, so that becomes their shared storage. And it's much, much easier to implement and manage at the fabric level than having to, you know, attach iSCSI, which requires network connectivity, or Fibre Channel, which requires physical cable and then fiber connectivity.
And I think another nice advantage for our hosters as well is it kind of provides a layer of abstraction for security. So you don't actually have to expose that underlying storage fabric. You can just say, here's your file, here's the path of your file, go connect to that, and now you can go build a guest cluster.
And the implementation is literally a piece of cake. All you do is you add a VHD to a machine, you point the VHD at a file share, and you come in and check this box called Enable Virtual Hard Disk Sharing, and just point 2 VMs at the same file. And they'll both see it as shared storage, just like an iSCSI LUN or a Fibre LUN or anything else. So it's the simplest way to accomplish it if you're running in a Hyper-V over SMB implementation. So that's that. So that's kind of some of the storage considerations, what you can do within the VMs themselves. There's a lot there. There's a lot you can do. There's a lot to think about. So let's move on and look at creating and configuring some virtual machines. So first of all, there's 2 types of VMs, Generation 1, Generation 2. I'm just kind of flicking back and forth between the 2 slides. Generation 1 VMs are your traditional VMs. They're based on the spec of what is a PC from circa 1921, I think, which is, you know, a couple of IDE controllers, a BIOS, you know, CD-ROM drive, a 100 meg network card. So it's you know, what we all traditionally thought of as a PC back, you know, in the days when a PC was a 400-pound screen and, you know, a couple of floppy disks. That's not what PCs are anymore. And if you think about the logic and all this, right, it's kind of funny to me. When virtualization first came out, the whole goal of virtualization was to make it identical to a physical machine so that there was no drawback. Now that virtualization's accepted and people go, it's not a bad thing, you know, we might actually use it a little while. Now it's, okay, how can we take advantage of the fact that it's virtualized and get something better because it's virtualized? And that's where this idea of a Gen 2 VM came from. Now, to create a Gen 2 or a Gen 1 VM is real simple, and in fact, there's not a whole lot of difference. These right here, by the way, are Gen 2 VMs. server 1, server 2. There's nothing any different about them. What's different about them is the hardware that they're based on. If you'll notice in here, there's no BIOS option. If I go look at a Gen 1 VM, which I believe, so this guy right here, this Win client is that's Gen 2. I think I have a Gen 1 here. Nope. We'll make it Gen 1.
Let's do it.
So a new virtual machine. We'll actually do it over here to make it easier to see.
Now, while you created that, one thing that you'll notice that comes up during the wizard is it actually prompts you. Do you want to create a Gen 1 or a Gen 2?
So,
go ahead.
So there's Gen 1, Gen 1. We'll take the defaults for this one, not too worried about it. So there's your prompt. And this is, by the way, you pick it now, you can never change it.
That's the important thing.
Well, actually, no, not entirely true. I'll get to that in a second. So you pick this now, and you can't come back through this wizard and change it. There's a tool that one of the Hyper-V guys released that will actually convert from Gen 1 to Gen 2 by essentially destroying the VM and recreating a definition using the same VHD. It's not a conversion. It does get it done.
Technically, it's unsupported. So we do want to, kind of caution you on the exam. If you get a question, can you convert? There is no built-in utility that's supported by Microsoft that allows you to do that. But there are third-party and community applications that can let you do that.
We're just hitting next on this a bunch of times, and we'll come back to this wizard in a second, but I want to show you the difference between G1 and G2. So here's the Gen 1. If I look at the settings on it, it's got the stuff you would expect to find in a PC, BIOS, right? You got memory, IDE controllers, things of that nature. If you look at the Gen 2, the Gen 2 is actually based on a UEFI.
Yep, UEFI.
One of those acronyms. UEFI BIOS as opposed to a traditional BIOS. So it's got a firmware configuration in here which does similar things, and it doesn't have IDE. It's only based on SCSI.
So a little more flexibility.
And a Gen 2 VM is generally better because the SCSI bus is generally better than IDE for everything within a VM. Because they're going to handle transactions better, commits better. So when you can, default to a Gen 2. That's my recommendation. When you can, default to a Gen 2. There's no functional difference other than, it's like buying a newer generation piece of hardware and putting Windows on it. There's nothing any different in how you administer it or manage it or work with it. It can still do everything the same way, but it's just a better architecture in general.
Absolutely. Now, some qualifications around that, you do have to make sure that the guest operating system is still specifically supported for Generation 2.
Correct.
So as you go through and create it, I will give you those options.
Yep.
But another thing that's we're seeing a lot of adoption or a lot of benefits from Gen 2, the fact that they do boot from SCSI. Now, this has been specifically interesting as we started to see people migrate from VMware. Now, VMware virtual machines, they always boot from IDE. Previous Microsoft Hyper-V virtual machines had to boot, they boot from SCSI. Previous Microsoft VMs had to boot from IDE. So as part of the migration process, you actually had to go and update the OS mapping within the VMs. Now using Generation 2 VMs, they can both boot from SCSI, skips that step, and simplifies the migration between the platforms.
Today, 2012 and Windows 8 or later are supported for Gen 2 VMs. So in terms of configuring settings for VMs, as you can see from the wizard that I ran through very, very quickly, you basically go memory, network, disk, done. Right? Generation, memory, network, disk, that's all you pick. Once you create the VM, by the way, if you do it through PowerShell, you can specify everything. You're really, really granular. Once you're created, that's when you can come in and modify all the different settings of the VM. So for example, the memory, and we'll come back and talk about dynamic memory here in a little bit. Number of processors, let's bump this one to 4 processors. Things like compatibility, the NUMA topology. So if I click use hardware topology, it'll actually go out, interrogate the hardware topology, and pick the best configuration for NUMA. In fact, if I bump this up high enough, it should actually alter itself. This one all the way to 12 cores. Let's apply that. And it's still using one socket for the VM, so okay. Yeah, still wants just one. You can manually modify this. There's no reason you would ever do it. So Hyper-V figures out the optimal topology. You can then add additional network adapters, connect network adapters. For example, just adding a network adapter here. And notice we've got options for legacy network adapters, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So add another network adapter connected to another switch, for example, or the same switch I want to do teaming. And then configure things like the integration services. So here's where I would go in and turn on the guest services, which is the enhanced session connection option. and then also configuring things like the checkpoint file location, which is the snapshot location, and also the smart paging file location, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. So these are your basic hardware settings, and then again, this is all exposed under VMM with actually a little more detail. And you can create profiles which are collections of these settings. So when you create a VM, you don't got to go configure all these settings. You just go create a VM and apply the high performance VM profile, which says 4 procs, 16 gigs of RAM, SMB based storage, and some other things. So you define all these, and you'll see this when you define all these within VMM. So dynamic memory. This is something that again came about around the time of remote FX and was initially targeted at VDI. Okay, so this isn't something that you will typically find on server implementation. This is something you typically find when you're virtualizing client operating systems for VDI, because user usage patterns tend to elevate and decrease a lot. There's a lot of variance in them. It's very easy to predict server resource consumption, right? If you're planning a SQL server, a SharePoint server, an Exchange server, there's tools that will tell you, hey, 20 users doing 100 emails a day, this is what you need, and it to be very consistent. With client operating systems, how much memory the client VMs are using, depends on what the Kardashians are doing at any given point in time. What's trending on Twitter. I don't know. I don't know, but that's the nature of it, right? And it's funny. I was actually in, I believe it was Amazon, I think, a number of years ago. There's their social media center, where they track all this stuff and they allocate resources based on what the Kardashians are doing, because it depends on determines what people buy, and they have it that precise. It's incredible. I'm embarrassed to even know that name. I got to admit it. I think I'm leaving right now. So with dynamic memory, what this will do is it will make more efficient use of your RAM by allocating memory up and down as VMs actually need it. So as VMs need more memory, it balloons up. As they no longer need memory, it balloons it back down and allocates it to other resources.